Good afternoon.
That's enough for me.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm David Blight, the director of Gilder Lehrman Center for Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. This is a panel marking the 200th anniversary of Frederick Douglass' birth, and among other things, we're doing the 20th anniversary of the Gilder Lehrman Center. We are not a center of Douglass studies. We give the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, but we do slavery and abolition all across the world. But for at least this week, we can do some Douglass. I want to first thank all my staff, my colleagues, my family at the GLC, Michelle Zachs for doing so much legwork about all this, Melissa, all the rest, and our resident genius graphic artist is Melissa, who does an amazing work. And I warn you, you might get a deal out of this one. Lee Fogg wants this for the cover of a paperback. I mean, it would really be perfect. And I'm her agent. So I want to be very brief and turn it over to my colleague, Jacqueline Goldsby. But the point of this panel was to invite a few friends, but primarily to invite people who have done very recent work on Douglass's life, in some ways particularly the personal side of his life, or are about to publish new work. And this includes the poet Nzadi Keita, you'll hear from, whose book you will hear all about 2 years ago. I think it was. She sent me a copy of this newly published book, Brief Evidence of Heaven, which is imagining a voice for Anna Murray Douglass, who remained illiterate. It's amazing material. And I tried today to tell her my favorites in the book, but of course she's going to read the poems she wants to read. But Hannah Rose Murray, I met in England when she was doing her PhD at Nottingham. You'll hear all about her work on Douglass's amazing tours of England, his network. She's done an extraordinary digital project about Douglass, a mapping of Douglass. Sarah Meir, whom I met the year I was at Cambridge in England, and got to know very well, and being a collaborator with her, is really the expert on Julia Griffiths, a very important woman, collaborator, professional partner in Douglass's life. And Lee Fogg, who has just published in the past year the book, The Women in the World, Frederick Douglass. A few of you were here from my class from last fall, and I got to hear Lee in that course. So this is an attempt to look at the life behind the times, as the title says, although we're not forgetting about the public person here, and that might be my role a little bit. I'll go last and throw some of the public into it, perhaps. But I'm especially grateful to Jackie Goldsby, a professor of English, chair of AFAM, African American Studies here at Yale, and does an enormous amount of civic work for this university and administration, for taking the time to do this. She's a major scholar, particularly of 20th century modern African American literature. She and I have been dreaming. She already does a seminar on James Baldwin, and I'm dreaming up with her the chance to do it with her at some point, but we haven't quite managed to find the time. So Jackie's going to introduce each speaker and then moderate our discussion, and then we will open it up to you. Jackie Goldsby. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I want to say a couple things before I begin my introduction. It's a real honor to be here with you today and to hear a fresh new scholarship on Douglass, so vital a figure. And though the introductions that I'm going to offer of our speakers might echo some of what David just shared with you, I think it's important in this space, in this room, as you look around you. This is one of the main lecture rooms for the English department. And we see, friezes on Dante, Shakespeare, Plato. Douglass deserves to be honored in this room.
There's even a Franklin over there.
Okay. And it's also important to, lift up the scholarship about African Americanist studies in this kind of space. So if my introductions kind of echo some of what David has already shared with you, I think it's important to mark the work we do in this field and in this space. So that is a preface. In my American Literature seminar last week, I taught Robert Hayden's praise poem, Frederick Douglass. In fact, I taught it in conversation with Witless when lilacs in the dooryard last bloomed, to think about the ways in which champions of democratic freedom and for the Black freedom struggle could be remembered. But it's Hayden's poem I want to talk a little bit with you about right now. It's a brief poem, a sonnet, about 14 lines, so for those of you who don't know it, I'll read it. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally one, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo-jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this slave, this Negro, beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien. This man, superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of a beautiful, needful thing. The poem, and especially its final lines, have lingered in my mind as I've awaited this panel, because Hayden's poem summons the point of our discussion today so succinctly, so vividly. What new histories, what new understandings, what new meanings of freedom itself become available to us? Because note how freedom evolves in this poem from the beautiful and terrible thing to a beautiful, needful thing over the course of those lines. If we remember Frederick Douglass differently, not in the form of bronzed history, statues, legends, wreaths, or even poems, but through the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful thing. Or that is, how can the intimacies and personal relations that shaped Douglass's life teach us about freedom? What do those stories have to offer us? And more precisely, as the poem's final metaphors of birthing and collectivity suggest, how might Douglass's relations with women reorient our models of history writing away from the singular actor in masculinist agency, this man, this Douglass, this former slave, this Negro, to groups, cohorts, and networks, the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of a beautiful, needful thing. Our distinguished panelists today will take up these questions in bold, exciting ways, and I'll introduce them in the order they'll speak. Lee Faught is Associate Professor of History at Le Moyne College in Syracuse, New York. She served as Associate Editor of the first volume of Frederick Douglass's correspondence at the Frederick Douglass Papers, published by Yale University Press in 2009. Her previous works include Southern Womanhood and Slavery, a biography of Louisa McCord, published by University of Missouri Press in 2003, and Mystic, Connecticut, From Pequot Village to Tourist Town, published by History Press in 2006. Her most recent scholarship on Douglass is the prize-winning book, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, just published by Oxford University Press last year in 2017. In that work, Professor Faught recasts the biography of the great African-American abolitionist through the eyes of the women who made him. The book was just recently awarded the New York Academy's Herbert Lehman Prize for Scholarship in New York History. Dr. Sarah Meir is Senior Lecturer in the English faculty and a Fellow at Selwyn College at Cambridge University. Her first book, Uncle Tom Mania, Slavery, Minstrelsy, and Transatlantic Culture in the 1850s, was published by University of Georgia Press in 2005. That work examined the reception on both sides of the Atlantic of the anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a finalist for the George Friedley Memorial Award from the Theater Library Association and has been excerpted in major casebooks about Stowe's novel. Dr. Meir is now finishing a book for Oxford University Press called Cousins and Claimants, Transatlantic Notions, 1820 to 1920. And this work features 2 chapters on Frederick Douglass's newspapers, as David alluded, including Julia Griffiths' editorial collaborations for them. Dr. Hannah Rose Murray received her PhD from the Department of American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham and is a visiting fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University. She's written about Black performance, celebrity, and networking strategies in Britain, and has organized numerous community events, including talks, plays, and exhibitions on both sides of the Atlantic. Her current research focuses on African American transatlantic visits to Britain between the 1830s and the 1890s. She argues that men and women like Frederick Douglass, Moses Roper, Ellen Pratt, and Ida B. Wells made a huge impact on British society, and together they educated millions of people about the brutal nature of American slavery and lynching. As David also alluded, Dr. Murray has created a website dedicated to these activist experiences, literally mapping their speaking locations across Britain, tracing how their ideas traveled far and wide, from large towns to small fishing villages, to raise awareness of American slavery and racism. Nzadi Keita is Associate Professor of English and the Coordinator of African American and Africana Studies at Ursinus College in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses in creative writing, American literature, and Africana studies. A poet scholar, Keita's work has appeared in Poet Lore and Crab Orchard Review, among other journals and anthologies. In 2017, she was named Pew Fellow of the Arts, and she is an alumna of Kave Kana, a collective of and for Black poets whose remarkable prize-winning output, I would say, makes it the most important and vital side of American poetry writing today. I think that's just true. Professor Keita's verse collection, Brief Evidence of Heaven, published in 2014 by Whirlwind Press, sheds light on Anna Marie Douglass, Frederick Douglass's first wife, through persona poems. And our last speaker, who shall not know a name, is David Blight, class of 1954, professor of American History at Yale University. He is also on the faculty of our African American Studies department, and so many of you know him too as the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale. He's the author of numerous prize-winning books, including Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, published by Harvard University Press in 2001, and American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, also published by Harvard University Press in 2011. His other published works include a book of essays, Beyond the Battlefield, Race, Memory, and the American Civil War, published by University of Massachusetts Press in 2002, and Frederick Douglass's Civil War, Keeping Faith in Jubilee, published by Louisiana State University Press in 1989. His much-anticipated biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, will be published by Simon & Schuster in October 2018. So our discussion today is we're going to follow that order, and each panelist will offer a first brief provocation summarizing her current research, teasing out the key discoveries and insights and the queries that the work has raised up about Douglass. Then we'll have a first conversation amongst them, because I'm sure you'll have questions and for each other, points of convergence, divergence that we want to highlight, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So I'd like to leave out. You can come up here.
Are we getting up? Or?
You don't have to.
You don't have to.
Are you all sitting?
I'm getting up, but because I've got a PowerPoint.
I'm sitting.
Okay.
I'll just sit because it's a little tight back here. So, hang on, I want to start my timer because I'll be here all day, as my students will tell you. Because I can talk a lot about Frederick Douglass. That's what my husband and I, when we met, he said, "So, tell me about your research." And I said, "Are you sure you want to know?" And he has heard about it. I'm not lying, every day since. So what I thought I'd do is, rather than just kind of go through the litany of the women that I cover, because there are a lot of them, is talk a little about how it came to write this, how I conceived of it, or rather, how it evolved as I conceived of the project about writing about women in the world of Frederick Douglass. I was working at the Frederick Douglass papers, and what I started to notice was all of these women around Douglass, how, especially when I got into the primary research, how all these women they were just there. And they weren't necessarily in the biographies. And of course, Julia Griffith is the one that sticks out the most obvious. And then of course, there's his wife. But these seem to be the most, there was more going on there. And when I started to read more of the primary research about women who were talking about him, because those abolitionists were a gossipy group of people, and everything that was going on around them, I started to realize just how much these women were there, yet not talked about. They were talked about in other venues about abolitionist women, but not in relation to him. And of course, I was falling in love with him, because you fall in love with your subjects. But he was a very fascinating figure. So what I originally wanted to do was write like a series of biographies, like chapter biographies of these women. And my friend Babu, who is a very wise person, who has the Jeopardy winning credentials, watch Jeopardy, he usually shows up on the reruns, to prove it. He said nobody's interested in them. Fit them together with the thing that is common. So I kept working on it. And what I realized wanting to see was, I wanted to understand him through them. I wanted to know their story. But part of what was drawing me to their story was a way of understanding him and then understanding the world around him. So I thought what would happen is if you looked at his biography and then you blurred out all the men, not eliminated them, just blurred them. And you blurred him and you just looked at the women, you brought them into sharp focus. And you started to tell their stories. And what would this say about him? And then what would this say about the world they lived in? Not just the world of abolition and reform, but of family life, of friendship, of women's aspirations in this world. And then as it grew, I realized it was like I was a personal story of these relationships, of a story that is wholly engaged. It's personal, but it is wholly engaged with a political world and a public world. And so this personal story, I realized to know him, you had to know these relationships, and to know these relationships, you had to know the women. And you had to know the women, the whole person. You had to know what their ambitions were, what their perspective was, what their skills were. What was this relationship about? And you couldn't just dismiss it as, well, it's a woman, so therefore it was romantic, or something superficial. There's something going on here. And then in doing so, it required asking questions about, there may never be answers to, but you have to try to present possible educated explanations. And this sometimes meant revisiting what we kind of consider very, basic concepts. Love. What does it mean? What does love between a mother and child mean when that child's going to be taken away? What does love mean between a mother and child when you know that child is never going to be taken away? What does love mean when, or do you even is love really at the top of your priority list when you're just trying to make a life together? And so revisit some of these concepts. And when you meet a person, what is the attraction there? What is a friendship about? And so even when it's not, when it's not two men, but a man and a woman, what is that friendship about? And so, it required rethinking those things within a historical context and the history of those very emotional kinds of things. And I was like, is there such a thing as a history of emotion? Oh, yeah, there is. There's a whole institute dedicated to it in Australia. It's like, wow. So anyway, So I had to, look at these things just, in their history, and look at these things in the context of time, but also in the context of class, but even more importantly, in the context of individual. And this is particularly important when people are making, speculations about Douglass and infidelity. It's like, okay, what did this mean to this man within the context of this man and the importance of family to him, and this man and the importance of having a black wife? And so having to take all of this together and put these pieces together and layer them on top of each other, all through this woman. So rather than just go, well, of course this happens because this is how people are. No, how was this man at this time in this place? Then I started to know, in women's history, there's always this debate about public and private. Is that really a useful tool to use anymore? And in the way that it was conceived of at the time, the domestic sphere, the prescriptive literature, that may not be a useful tool. But what I found is that there's this terrain of public space and private space. To say that that doesn't exist is foolish, because we live with that even today. What we reveal on Facebook, how we reveal it on Facebook, and what we don't. And so what we have is this kind of territory of what you let people know and what you don't, what is out there and what is private, what you present and what you don't present. And so this public-private, it's a border, it's negotiable, and it becomes a territory that's contested. It becomes a territory of control. And so for a black couple, having privacy is important, especially when you have people who are trying to intrude on that privacy or deny you that privacy. Whereas for an interracial couple, publicity becomes important. Look, this is not clandestine. This is not sordid. This is a partnership. This is equal. This is affection. So to take these into consideration. And so in many ways it was like, I was just reading Du Bois with one of my classes, and it's like that double veil. What your awareness of yourself, but then also being aware of what the public perceives of you. And so manipulating what the public sees of you, manipulating, knowing what they see, and using that politically. And so that, when Douglass walks down the street in New York with a white woman, not as a servant, not as her servant, and not as anything but equals, and gets attacked for it. I mean, that's a very public act. When he's standing on the stage, a very political act. When he's standing on a stage with Abby Kelly, and they're both standing there, defying what is expected of the two of them, that's a political act. When he's married and he has, look, Anna and I got married by a minister, and a married woman was a witness. This is important. It's public, and we want to show this. This is, it's kind of a screw you to his master, basically. But it's also a screw you to people who say this can't happen. So these things become, personal acts, but also political acts. So starting to understand all of these levels of what these things that are, and they got married, and then he goes out and he gives a speech. Well, what does that marriage mean within the context of going out and making those speeches? And then, so in approaching his life from the woman's side, it becomes much more of a complicated man. Oh God, that sounded very, did you guys hear Shaft go through your head? Okay, sorry. But he becomes, his life becomes much more layered. And it doesn't become, like when you often read biographies, They go out in the public life and then they come home. And they get married, and then they go out in the public life and they come home and they have a baby. And then they go out in the public life and they come home and a baby dies. And then they go out in life and a kid gets married. And so it's just kind of flip-flopping. And what I found was it wasn't so much a flip-flop. The two are very much tied together. And then as his daughter grows up, she has to negotiate many of these things. But you can ask more about that later. And then one of the things I also found out, which was surprising, this was the last chapter I wrote because I couldn't deal with it, was women's rights. And this is the thing, most people when they hear I wrote this book, they think it's either going to be a lot sexier than it is. And it's not sexy at all. And they think it's, or they
You're
think,
very disappointing.
I know. And then they're like, oh yeah, women's rights. And the women's rights was like, there's not a lot of there. And I kept, it's like, what is there? And what I found was that the narrative about Douglass and women's rights is largely controlled by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and where they put him in that narrative, and how they cast him in that narrative. And when I started to look into it, and even now today, the myth of Susan B. Anthony and Douglass being best friends, that's not what I found in the documents while it was happening on the ground. And so when I started to realize that this is a creative narrative in the late 19th century for women's suffrage, and I had to go back and look, well, what is Douglass actually doing? It made me re-look at women's rights and black men's roles in women's rights. And what I found was that his work in racial uplift, especially in black education, this is where this provided an opportunity to provide a woman's right, to advance a woman's rights agenda, even when it was not explicitly called a woman's rights agenda. And as it, the black civil rights movement did have problems with black masculinity, and especially as it got towards the Civil War, everything got very butch, that fell to the side. Ultimately, what I found was that Frederick Douglass was always there pulling women to the forefront, advancing them. Oh, he wants me to shut up.
No.
Okay.
That's not what that said.
advancing women to the forefront to speak, to advance women's rights within the black civil rights movement. And what I found out was that in many ways in this narrative, he was a much better women's rights man than they were black civil rights advocates. And so that was what I kind of discovered in writing this book. And I think the bottom line that I discovered was, usually they talk about the woman behind the man, and that becomes a cliche. And I found throughout his life, at all key moments, it was usually a woman who was there to push him up to the next level, to help him succeed. And so what I found is really more than most other men, he was a woman. That would have been another story. He was a man who was made by women. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a great honour and pleasure for me to be here. I'm talking about Julia Griffiths, and I was very worried when I realised I had to talk with Lee, because Lee's 2 chapters about Julia Griffiths have advanced knowledge about her so much, I wondered whether there'd be anything left for me to say. But I'm going to try. Julia Griffiths was an Englishwoman who arrived in Douglass's life at a crucial moment in 1849 when his fledgling paper was foundering. It was strapped for cash. He was struggling to manage it alongside a punishing lecture schedule. And as he gratefully acknowledged ever after, she restored his paper's fortunes by a combination of fundraising and better business management. This, in turn, alleviated Douglass's own personal financial problems and enabled him to do some of his most important writing and campaigning in the lead-up to the Civil War. So she's most important, I think, in those years, 1849 to 63. Now, for a long time, Griffiths' contribution to Douglass's work was rather neglected in the scholarship, or even worse, she was treated as an entertaining footnote, and biographers rehashed smears and innuendos put about in the early 1850s by Douglass's rivals. Lee's book, rather wonderfully, rectifies that, and it takes Griffiths seriously as an extremely effective business partner, fundraiser, and all-round collaborator for Douglass over a period of just over 10 years. So I can add to that picture by relating Griffiths, and therefore Douglass, to the flowering of popular print culture in the 1830s and 40s. I'm just going to... Okay. Now, Douglass's paper emerged at a moment when new technology was making it possible to print and circulate newspapers and periodicals more cheaply and more widely than before. Scores of new periodicals emerged in the period 10 or 20 years before his paper, and there was also a boom in occasional publications such as gift books and annuals. Douglass's own papers are, of course, part of this story, as are many abolitionist papers, and his papers reflect the way that new publications were bringing a variety of new perspectives and new political voices to the world of print, especially women's voices. As feminist literary historians have pointed out, this early 19th century boom of magazines and annuals provided opportunities for women as writers and editors, and in both Britain and the United States. And one of the things I want to suggest is that Julia Griffiths' work for Frederick Douglass' papers is part of that picture. It reflects a fact that I don't think historians have noticed enough yet, that Douglass's newspapers provided an outlet and visibility for a number of women as writers and as campaigners. Griffiths above all, but by no means uniquely. It is recognised, I think, that Douglass's papers enabled black writers, but mostly those writers that people are registering are his special correspondents from various cities who tended to be men. And the women haven't been considered very thoroughly at all. Now, while Griffiths was working with Douglass in Rochester, she edited 2 gift book volumes, The Autographs for Freedom. They were published simultaneously in London and Rochester, and the first one, of course, included Douglass's only novella, The Heroic Slave. So just as an editor, she published this important text. And the other point to make about Griffiths in relation to Frederick Douglass's publications is that she helped consolidate his transatlantic connections. I'm not just talking about his anti-slavery links, although she absolutely did work on consolidating those, but I'm thinking about his allegiances in the world of print, and particularly radical or progressive print. There's the autographs again. And in particular, Griffiths reinforced his friendship with the radical editors William and Mary Howitt who in turn were closely connected with most of the literary and artistic life of London, and in fact Europe, because Mary Howitt was a translator of German, Swedish and Danish. So this is what we know about Julia Griffiths, and it's not very much. She was born in 1811. Although her name, Griffiths, she has a brother called Thomas Powys Griffiths, and is clearly Welsh, but her family lived between Kent and London. Her father was a stationer and printer and sometimes publisher. He'd also suffered business failures, going bankrupt twice. I think both those things are very suggestive in relation to Douglass. She knew about how to keep businesses going because she'd had to learn how to keep businesses going, and precisely the kind of business they were engaged in with his papers. Reading between the lines a little more, she must have had moderate financial means of her own, and she and her sister travelled to the United States, supported themselves, and even helped Douglass out with his mortgage. Given her writing and copy editing skills, she must have been educated. Given her energies, and going by her letters and others' responses to her, she must have been quite tactless and difficult. The flip side of qualities we might also call formidable, unconventional, even sometimes brave. She lived in Douglass's home with his family for some years, which caused comment because it crossed race boundaries and because it was unconventional behaviour for an unmarried woman. She and her sister encountered hostility when they walked or travelled with Douglass in New York City, on boats, and elsewhere. They not only endured this, they used it to campaign. They wrote to British newspapers about it and caused a kind of international furore about how Douglass was being treated ridiculously. Douglass trusted Griffiths enough to run the paper occasionally when he was ill or away. We know this because he mentions it sometimes. And she played a role in the escape of the fugitive William Parker to Canada. William Parker was wanted by the federal authorities for shooting someone in his escape, so helping him was a serious crime. And she went down to the dock and got him a place on the boat. Physically brave, I think. Julia Griffiths was also steeped in the world of print. Among the items that we know her father published are books of poetry, a French language journal of culture called Le Mercure Étranger, and a trade paper for wine and spirits merchants called the Licensed Victuallers magazine. Now, Douglass was a committed temperance man, so this is a little surprising. But I think it's worth noticing that the Licensed Victuallers aimed to provide its readers with a wider cultural ambiance, facetious and entertaining subjects, so as to give it interest in the most respectable family circles. This is not too far removed from the back page of Frederick Douglass's newspaper, which also printed literary material, poems, reviews, and serial fiction. And Griffiths' own columns did something of the same thing. While she was in Rochester and working daily on the paper, Griffiths wrote 2 regular columns. One was a letter directly addressed to one of the most famous women in British periodical writing at the time, Letter to Mrs. Howitt. These are the Howitts again. And the Howitts were radicals, former Quakers of modest background. They made their living writing and editing. They wrote extensively for periodicals, including their own Howitts Journal in 1847-8. Douglass's British supporters collected money to help start his paper from the Howitts office. And as his paper began, the Howitts reported on how he was doing, praising and cheering from their own platform in their own paper. The Howitts were, as I said, amongst the best connected writers in London, friends with romantic poets, with Carlyle, Thackeray and Dickens, and also women writers. Elizabeth Gaskell she's my favourite, made her debut in Howitt's Journal. They were not brilliant business people. Howitt's Journal only lasted 2 years. And when it folded, Charles Dickens recruited them to work for his magazine Household Words. So at one step, I think there was a connection with Dickens. So when Frederick Douglass' paper published Julia Griffiths' letter to Mrs. Howitt, it was signalling a number of things. It was indicating an important cultural and political alliance that stretched all the way to London, and it included all of Douglass's readers in a transatlantic network of friendship. So Griffiths' friendship with Mrs. Howitt became, by extension, everyone's friendship with Mrs. Howitt. Griffiths' letter was personal in flavour, and it reported passionately on anti-slavery and other political matters. But it also reviewed cultural events, particularly international visitors. One of them was the Swedish writer Fredrika Bremer, whose translator was Mary Howitt. When Griffiths returned to Britain, she created a similar transatlantic report, only in reverse, remarking on British culture and politics in letters from the old world. And she published 87 of these columns. And I don't think these columns were regarded as self-indulgent. Several of Douglass's correspondents, including Nubia here, his San Francisco correspondent, expressed appreciation for Griffiths' writing. Now I want to round things off with something very silly. It's an excruciating pun published in Douglass' paper, which links 3 writers, William Howitt, Charles Dickens, and Robbie Burns. As you'll remember, the Howitts were working for Household Words, so there may have been a connection with Dickens that he was reinforcing there. A gentleman looking upon an extensive conflagration expressed his surprise in 3 words, each the name of an English author: Dickens, how it burns. So I want to suggest that even in this joke, the private and personal connections are overlapping with editorial writerly connections. And there's an interaction between communities of readers and writers. And at the centre of some of those lines of correspondence and allegiance is Julia Griffiths, forging transatlantic connections in a world of print was one of the ways she contributed to Douglass's work. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thanks to the GRC and everyone who's organised this event and for inviting me here in the first place. So my research looks at Douglass in the UK and Ireland as well, and as you can see on the left I've mapped some of his speaking locations. So most of the locations you see come from his first trip to Britain, which was between 1845 and 1847. And at the end of his trip, he says he's given roughly 300 lectures. And in total, I've mapped around 220, something like that. So that's as many as I can find. So obviously, there's still a few more out there. So keep in mind this is a work in progress. But I love talking about Douglass's relationship to the UK, particularly on this side of the pond, because it's not necessarily a subject that attracts a lot of attention, or not a lot of people know that Douglass actually went to the UK in the first place. He actually went 3 times. And his first trip in 1845 was the most successful. And he not only had a very huge impact on the UK, but as already that's been alluded to, the UK had a huge impact on Douglass. From the British perspective, the newspapers waxed lyrical about him, his speaking ability. They called him a Negro Hercules, a modern Demosthenes after the classical orator. People wrote songs about him, poetry after they were inspired by hearing him speak. And they reported the controversies that Douglass created hundreds of times across the whole country, and even in places where he didn't actually visit, which I think is really significant. And in turn, Britain had a very important impact on Douglass. He not only established really important friendships that he would cherish throughout the rest of his life. Obviously, we've heard about Julia Griffiths as well. English abolitionists raised money to purchase his legal freedom. So when Douglass returned to the States, he was, in the eyes of the US government, legally not enslaved anymore. And again, English abolitionists raised money to buy him a printing press, which led him to his career as a journalist. And the really interesting thing about these maps, sort of mapping the speaking locations, is that you can start to see some of the networks that he created. And by visualising his trip, and I'm mainly talking about his 1840s trip now, you can see not only who he stayed with, where he travelled, why he's giving so many lectures in certain places. So you can see on the left image, you can see several lectures in Bristol. He stayed with the Esslin family, who were friends with William Lloyd Garrison. Douglass had travelled to Britain at that time under William Lloyd Garrison's friendship and supervision and working for Garrison's Anti-Slavery Society. So that automatically meant that Garrison's friends opened their homes to him across the UK. So having a friend in John and Mary Esslin in Bristol meant that Douglass would stay there and give several speeches there. And again, keeping on the theme of women, obviously Mary Esslin was an important person in Bristol. The Wigham family and Jane Wigham in Edinburgh was really important. In Dublin, you have the Webb family. In Glasgow, you had John Murray and William Smeal. Jane Jennings and her family in Cork. And again, Julia Griffiths as well, as we've mentioned. So these networks were really important for Douglass, especially when you compare his experience to other African Americans who visited the UK, because Douglass was automatically had so many doors open to him. These abolitionists, including the women we've talked about, would organise lectures for him. Sometimes they would pay for the fee for the particular hall where he was lecturing in. Mary Esslin helped her father print and distribute over 3,000 handbills to one of his lectures. They also distributed copies of Douglass's 1845 narrative around the city before Douglass had even got there, as a way to sort of entice and sort of anticipate his visit. And he also became really close with the Richardson family in Newcastle, which again explains why he had several lectures there. And the Richardson family were really key in raising the money to purchase Douglass's freedom, as I've alluded to, and I suspect they were also very key in organising an extra train one night after Douglass had given a lecture. So basically, they were very middle class, had a lot of connections, and a special train was put on at about 10:15 in the evening to allow people in neighbouring towns to come and see Douglass, but also return home in the evening, which is quite an extraordinary thing. It didn't necessarily happen a lot. And speaks a little bit about sort of that early tourism, sort of going out of the town to listen to hear somebody speak. And I don't have a lot of time to go into, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, about the tension between Douglass and some of these, not only female abolitionists, but primarily white, all white abolitionists. There was a lot of tension there, particularly over the purchase of his freedom, which I think is something that is really important. But one of the other things I want to talk about is this concept of public and private, which Lee was referring to. And I think one of the other things about mapping his experience shows that, if I go back to my original slide, you can see not only that he covered the UK fairly extensively, but to me, when I finally looked at the final image, I was thinking that this is exhausting. And it's not that he's going from one end of the country, so from Scotland down to London. He's doing a massive zigzag, and that's one of the things I wanted to do, actually, just sort of plotting the way in which he was travelling around. It was incredibly exhausting. And we have to think about not only the travelling around, we have to think that Douglass, as a formerly enslaved individual, is talking about his life as a slave, sometimes nightly, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours in the evening, sometimes twice a day, and he's repeating these traumatic instances that not only happened to him, but also instances that he's seen. So it led me to think about what's the cost of activism itself? And I think mapping this forced me to go back into the archives to see whether this kind of public and private Douglass, as it were, this divide, did it manifest itself? You know, did this private exhaustion and trauma, which Douglass must have been experiencing and did experience, did that show itself in public at all? So to give one example, in the spring, in May 1846, I'll just give you an example of his lecturing schedule. So for 1 week in May, he spoke at an anti-slavery meeting on the Monday, a Peace Society meeting on the Tuesday, a suffrage meeting on the Wednesday, a temperance meeting on the Thursday, and then on the Friday, he spoke to another anti-slavery meeting for 3 hours, roughly talking to about 2,500 people. So hearing that relentless schedule, it's perhaps no surprise to learn that Douglass became very ill at the end of 1846. And he actually had to cancel a meeting in Leeds because, as one abolitionist, Mary Brady, put it, a fit of sickness had sapped his usual strength. But when he actually finally attended this rescheduled meeting, even the local newspaper correspondent noticed, and I'm quoting, he was evidently labouring under a severe disposition, and halfway through his speech, his strength failed him, and he was compelled to resume his seat, requesting that someone might address the meeting until he had, in some measure, recovered. So this exhausting lecturing tour impacted on Douglass's performance, which is such a rare source. And you can still see that. So near the end of his journey, so he leaves in spring 1847, near the end of that journey, a correspondent in Warrington noted that his speeches, quote, were suffering from great debility owing to the large amount of fatigue he has lately endured. So these cracks in this lionized image reveal the man behind the celebrated mask, that public-private divide. And I think the infrequency in which he let that exhaustion show in public really speaks to how well his performances were orchestrated and how he was such an important and powerful performer. So I just want to end on another final anecdote. So Douglass returns to the UK in 1859, and it's comparatively to his first visit. It's a very short trip. He only stays until early 1860 because his daughter Annie dies a couple of months into 1860. And in his final autobiography, his Life and Times, that was published in the 1880s, he mentions how he immediately arranged passage back to the US, obviously upon hearing this. But reading through the Victorian newspapers actually reveals that, yes, he did obviously do that. He tried to return home as soon as possible and booked the next steamer. But he didn't cancel his anti-slavery lectures. So at one meeting in Ayr in Scotland, the newspaper correspondent actually notices that Douglass is suffering a depression. So the correspondent says, Douglass, though eloquent, was evidently labouring under a depression. After nearly an hour, Mrs. Douglass apologised to the audience and said he had that morning received a letter from America bringing the melancholy tidings of the death of one of his family. The correspondent noted that while the meeting, which no doubt was disappointed a little in not bearing the address out, deeply sympathised with Mr. Douglass in his bereavement. And a couple of days later, he does another anti-slavery speech in Paisley, and the correspondent again notices that Douglass was evidently undergoing a severe mental struggle produced by the intelligence received within the last day or two that one of his children had died. What's terribly sad and interesting about this particular speech is that the correspondent goes on to say that Douglass somehow recovers, and I'm quoting, he carries on a speech replete with the most thrilling passages of eloquence and shaded by a series of sparkling jokes. So I just want to end on this concept that, considering that Douglass had spoken on the day that he'd found out that his own daughter had died, and continued to do that a couple of days later, that he's really struggling with this private and public man, with this private grief is overflowing into a public performance, which I think we have to understand Douglass as a man, we have to consider that public and private divide. Thank you.
Good evening. Sorry, I can't quite see you guys over there. I like to kind of see people. My name is Nzadi Keita, and I'm so pleased and thankful to be here with you today. I'd like to make a special thanks to David, Melissa, and Michelle for all of their work in putting this event together. And I'd like to dedicate this reading to my parents. I'm not going to give a lot of context to the poems I'm going to read in hopes that we can save that for the Q&A. I will tell you that the name of my book is Brief Evidence of Heaven, Poems from the Life of Anna Mary Douglass. And I'll tell you that I suppose I researched Anna Mary Douglass and imagined her at the same time for about 3 years, and the poems started to percolate amidst that time. I was also actually working on my doctorate, so that working on these poems was my little secret mission. And in that time, I developed a list of adjectives about Anna that drove my poems, and they are these: curious, visionary, pragmatic, sensitive, perceptive, kind, analytical, dreamy, mystical, angry, insecure, deliberate, and vigilant. The book is organized according to, in a chronological fashion and in a geographical fashion. So the poems start in Baltimore, where they met, where she met her husband, and poems then take place in Massachusetts, and then in Rochester in that period that we're all probably most familiar with, and then in Washington, D.C., where she died. So I'm going to read sort of across those, across the breadth of the book, so that you get a sense of what I wrote at different points in her journey. This poem is called Thursday. Who counts those at rest while secret stacks of money pile and pile? Who measures the Saturdays by pound? Who measures the Saturdays by pound of soiled clothes for one more coin? 9 miles to town adds up how many steps? What scale holds still or tells? Who stands to judge and tally? Who stares into lavender? Who sucks blood off her knuckles, binds her joints, crosses her fingers? Who digs his in? then slaps the mare's hind parts? Who sprinkles song on the waters? Is it God? I guess I should have said, David said early on, but I should have said that the poems are all written in persona, so the voice you're hearing is mostly Anna's voice. I think I am going to do one that's in the voice of Annie, who was just mentioned, the youngest child who died at 11 years old. So I expected the whole book to be in Anna's voice. And then, funny thing about poems, things start happening. And so some other folks have a moment in here as well. This poem reflects the fact that I believe that Anna Mary Douglass was a striver and wanted to teach herself the alphabet and eventually learn how to read and write. Letter C. When God brushed crumbs from those deep linings, you must have fallen out. Sturdy little wonder, rolling in the world on your own. You feel so particular. A stone I have carried for weeks in this apron pocket to calm my fingers teaches them how to make your cool salute, your round answer. Here's something I didn't expect, but again, it's a creative process. This poem comes from the Massachusetts section, and it's the sky speaking. So the poem is called 1845, Sky Speaking. The man of the house is wild, lion-spirited, in a way he corrals with buttons. He who loves the air also loves his roar, his consequences, rough or shine. Loves to jostle wide storms, the barreling forces we squat and deliver. A certain flavor counters his emphatic flair, that one. Much wrongdoing curdles in his wake. The woman is two women. A dead twin in broken threads enchants her living and climbs her mind. Asleep or waking, she will always wear this breath weight. Already she balances the leakage of this crooked crown with knowledge of her own, which is to say she lives twice. Laughing now with the man, she tunes her ferocious machine for an unthinkable walk, 30 years and more, to the farthest meadow, the undreamed hill, this one. The might of her hips is a might never measured in full day, never yet sung. This is the last poem in the Massachusetts section. As Douglass is, it's 1846, and he's on tour, as we've heard about, and she dreams, and sometimes her dreams become poems. This is called 1846, Waking Early. One dream walks toward me in his old clothes, blue striped shirt, denim pants. His frown draws a thick rain and clouds drop, covering his head. We drift in white to another time. His black collar jacket rises off the bed and he grows to life inside. A hand-sewn, finely fitted shirt shows, creamy, under his vest. I fall against a feverish tree, knowing before knowing. Once it begins to starch my fingers, once it begins to pucker, I leap away. Some gentle voice slaps me down when I come carrying his tray, assures me it will get hotter, hotter, claiming heat will show me all. Blowing across a yard in Rochester, an odd place I seem to know, where full voices leak out of lost ships. Blood surprises, painting the stove nearby, painting my poor yellow roses, now awake and forced to catch these red slaps, forced to swallow. Dear Douglass, what an unkind dance, I remember thinking. Looking up, sooty blood and bloody soot at the hip. Half his body swings, and half just gone. Parts of him dropping onto my shoulders. Tomorrow caught in his lips. A hairy finger snags my apron pocket. So a couple of poems from Rochester. This one is called Quiet. It's in 7 sections. I'm not gonna subject you to all that. But this theme of education again, of self-education, if you will. So I'm going to read 3 sections. The longest one is the first one. It's called With Eyes. And we've heard about the North Star. Many of you know that Harper's magazine was a significant magazine at the time, and that's mentioned. I don't think there's anything else that's surprising. My husband oversees the world up front, where all the parlor talk is Congress and North Star and Harper's, and what they know is only what they read. When I pass, the readers squint into my mouth with eyes that you could use to sharpen something. I watch him worry, watch him when I raise my brow, watch his eyes burn off my work scarf, watch him whittle me with the corner of his mouth and blush as I go. Up front, I am a curiosity. Smoke, hail, squawking, a twisted sound out of place, like a goat in the library, like a hammer in a keyhole, like a riverbank giving birth to a woman. Come where it is quiet. Come through my house to the back, where no one is afraid of what I say. Out back in the garden, what I am teaching myself, the wild letters I mark down with a stick, don't concern the parlor. I stand at the door, black flesh of little use to them. Nothing here to buy, to know, nothing here for barter, for bluster, debate. They have what they need. They have eaten. The second one is much shorter. It's called Terror. Far into the night, 1 or 2 words make the difficult trip upstream. Come morning, these land, burning the will to ride my tongue. Oh, they swell, bigger than terror. Just let my breath go slack. They spill, they spill. in the last section of this poem. It's called Still. Cut me open after I go. You will find the pieces, glass and silver words, cracked, strewn in the wild trees. My house still, my house sprouting. Even now, the dark demanding crystals catch on the tail of my dress, and runaways take up the words like apples. The doors of my house will break off their hinges and fly when I say what I say. This is one of the few sonnets in the book. Didn't think I had a sonnet in me, but trying to be the vessel here. So this one starts with an epigraph by one of my sort of patron saints of the project, Rosetta Douglass Sprague, who wrote a little booklet about her mother that I was happy to find. The poem is called Sterling. The epigraph is this: being herself one of the first agents of the Underground Railroad, Mother was an untiring worker. By now, their breath has thawed. They're drunk on sleep. A trouser-wearing woman with one hand just sits. Her mouth stays fixed on calling Seal, her daughter's dead name rubbed to burlap strands. A boy whose rough, low singing charms the room stands up, but loses words to bless the food. Some stare, some cradle every taste, some lean too close, too near the fire as I stir. One eats the steam. This choir of beef and beans could harmonize and banish what they thought would never die. A bit of food and music is no cure in truth, but what I cook into this stew does make these shadows talk. They'll feel their new selves catch and light. Now, watch what black hands do. Okay, a little behind schedule. Gotta do this one, gotta go there. And it's called Attic Window. It's from near the end of the Rochester section. And it too has an epigraph from Maria Diedrich. Quote, Ottilie Assing's Letters to Douglass, which she wrote as a lover of more than 20 years, celebrated a familiar, rich sensuality. Those Tuesdays when I climbed the attic loft, the window was a comfort, high and far, that called me from my trials, like thrushes called to song. I waited out the visits when Miss Ottilie came. A blue-eyed weed my husband found. She was no guest. The downtown eyes called her the public wife, who claimed his arm and took his books into her foreign mouth. The bitter when Fred auctioned off my place. She laughed and laughed, of course, at me. How could a mammy be a match for such a princely man? I heard her hiss. She wrote his speeches, left her name in drawers. The halls bowed out as if the house had witnessed too much pain, a swollen, unhealed shape. I went up high and listened to her playing at my life. I cut some cloth to fix her, but I knew that conjure would bring ruin. And now, latched to the bed, I wish I'd kept those scraps of silk to learn a softer side, to teach my hands new joys, hands that our abolition-loving liar once called pause.
I dared her to read that one.
Yes, I did. Let's see, quick assessment here. Okay, all right, we're almost here, guys. You've been a lovely audience. Since I mentioned it, I feel I have to read this poem. So I got very caught up. I have 2 sons. I knew that mom gene. And just the thought of Anna Mary Douglass having to watch her child die alone and bury her before Douglass came back. And the youngest, somehow, had an impact. So at that point, Annie, I start to hear her voice from beyond the grave. And it turns into 7 poems, and this is one of them. This is the 4th spirit letter. I am speed now, Mama, sweetness itself, the brimming dawn inside you. I am red doors, mouthfuls, our glorious hair. I am green skirts carrying northern lakes straight to your feet. I am all surfaces and joys, always sound, never bells. I am the feel of things. So finally, okay, I'll do this. I'll just do it. I'll just blast it through. This is 2 more. This was really the first poem that kind of, I was writing poems in the 3rd person, sort of, me as the speaker, poet person looking at Anna's life. And they just weren't working. And this was the first one where, so this is probably the oldest poem, when I realized that I needed to conjure her voice, or a voice for her, to be more to the point. And if you've read the narrative, 1845 narrative, you know about Mr. Covey and the slave breaking, quote unquote, turned into a butt whipping for him. So other than that, here we go. It's called History. And again, Rosetta Douglass Sprague has an epigraph at the beginning. It was no unusual occurrence for mother to be called up at all hours of the night, cold and hot as the case may be, to prepare supper for a hungry lot of fleeing humanity. And I came upon that before I took the Cedar Hill tour in Washington. And you would think that Frederick Douglass did everything if you listen to the tour guide. So, history. We will be something more than we are now. Our crumbled days and nights, our saddest parts, will mix like ash and dirt, kept secret, pounded down by traveling feet. Some later man will cry some rugged song in praise to Douglass. Write the sun up as he used to do, then walk a while with God, but never knowing. Walk in the leaves, trampling afternoon. His thoughts will tumble, words all dressed in flags and velvet, swelling up like boils, jumping to his feet, pretending he is Douglass, struck by Covey, spitting fire. And when the writer turns to me, what shape will fill his mouth? How many pages will he need for laundry, heaping plates, and croup that breaks at dawn to heed the mark of my accounts? Will it be said that I could speak, seal cracks? And years from now, who will remember bread and stew that set those bound to Canada on their feet? 400 buried shackles in my garden. Will he paint across my truth 100 years from now? Or hush me silent on a page that reads the wife of an important man? I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
think I should just turn this over to Q&A, frankly, and just let you have at it. I'll do a little bit of my part. I just want to say, though, that as I mentioned a couple of years ago, this book, Nzadi just read from, just arrived in my mailbox. I didn't know anything about it. We'd never met. Beautiful inscription. And I have spent hours and hours with this book. That's the truth. I even have portions of 2 of your poems in the book. I use them when I'm trying to get at Anna. I'm trying to get at her inner world. My editor wanted both of them out because, not evidence, so on. I fought for them, they're staying.
Thank you.
So, and I want to thank Jackie for reading that Robert Hayden poem. My God. That is one of his many, but it's just one of his perfect poems. I've used it a zillion times, especially with public audiences. It's just, and your critique of it was wonderful, by the way. Anyway, all I want to say is this. Daniel, do you want to stick up that one picture? I'm really cheating here. It's going to be an image of the cover of the new book, but yeah, what the hell. The book I've just written is developed around 6 major themes. I'm not going to go into them all, don't worry. I'm going to name them and say a little bit about 2 of them, which reflects the themes of this amazing discussion that we've already heard. First theme is words. Words. We don't know Douglass without the great word. So words are a leitmotif throughout the book, the genius of words. 2 is deep grounding in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And the whole book sort of makes a case for why he merits the label prophet. 3rd is the power and the problem of the great autobiographies, 1,200 pages of them. The first problem in the biography of Douglass is the autobiographies. They're a great source, but they're also always in the way. And he is remarkably silent about most of the things we're discussing here today. All of the things we're discussing here today. And the 4th is Douglass the intellectual, the thinker, the writer in so many genres, the artist, and trying to understand where that came from and how he mastered it. Enough said. The 5th, I'll say a little more about it, is how a radical outsider, an abolitionist, a radical abolitionist, became over time a political insider. It's a great story. And it's a story that is reflected in many other, particularly African American leaders, into the 20th century and beyond. Lots of leaders. What does a radical reformer do when he wins his cause? Or so it seems, he's won his cause. And then what does he do if he lives another 30 years and long enough to see it all betrayed? In the first place, that's good for biography because it's a hell of a trajectory. But he was the outsider, total outsider, who becomes a Republican Party functionary after the Civil War by the 1870s, gets federal appointments. I could go on more about that, but the 6th theme, and that's where I want to pick up on all of our themes here today and try to do it quite quickly, is this turbulent, Hannah named it quite beautifully, this turbulent balance in his life, or lack of balance, between the public and private registers of his life. We know Douglass, and for good reason, as the genius of words, the political thinker, the constitutional thinker. All sorts of political theorists are now writing about Douglass. Lots of law professors are writing about Douglass. They teach his Edinburgh speech on the Constitution in most law schools now. He's been, of course, taught literature forever. He's been discovered in many genres or departments of the academy. And we should know him as the great public man, the great visage
And you should know him through his learned pragmatic politics. There's a tremendous set of lessons, if you like, complexities about learning politics out of a world of radical reform. That also has many, many legacies in our own time. But there's a private and a personal standing in his life that is always just behind that public man. A couple of just quick examples, and it goes to Sarah's talk. And sorry, no, everybody here knows this. Douglass had in his lifetime, I think, and, you know, there's no way to measure this, he had at least 2 genuine emotional breakdowns, nervous breakdowns, if you want to call them that, maybe even a third. But the first big one was in the early 1850s, when Julia Griffiths is helping him with his newspaper, with his house, with his life, with his profession, with his future. As is Gerrit Smith, the wealthy abolitionist in upstate New York, who was basically the underwriter of his newspaper. And by the way, Julia did all that fundraising with Gerrit Smith. But Douglass came apart. There's just no question about it. We have a dozen or more letters by Julia, and Lee has done beautiful things with this in her book, writing to Gerrit Smith and to a few other people, describing Douglass as immobile, unable to use his limbs, extremely depressed, quote-unquote suicidal, on and on and on and on. Describes staying up late at night with him, reading favorite passages of Robbie Burns, and singing favorite hymns, and so forth and so on. He came to pieces. He was the self-made man who could not provide. He couldn't put food on the table. He has no other profession. Actually, from the day he left working on the docks in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and joined the Garrisonians on the lecture circuit, until he got hired as the Marshal of the District of Columbia in 1877, he never had any other job or employment than that newspaper and oratory on the constant itinerant circuit. He was all but broke, trying to sustain this black anti-slavery newspaper under ferocious attack from the Garrisonians, both ideologically and now personally, because they blew up this scandal, alleged scandal, that he was having an affair with Julia Griffiths, which some of us don't believe really happened in that case. We can disagree a little on some other cases, but that's fine. But in that moment of, say, 1850 to 55, the early 50s, he's in his 30s, he comes emotionally to pieces. And by the way, he admits it even in his newspaper. There are several moments in the newspaper where he explains why he wrote no editorials this week. I'm unable to, I'm too ill, I'm too sick, I'm not capable. And he says Julia Griffiths is carrying the paper this week, next week, this week, next week. Anyway, in that moment of his life, that 4 to 5 year period, he did arguably the greatest work of his life. He did the one novella, The Heroic Slave. He mastered the short form editorial, the great political editorial of his newspapers, and he wrote hundreds and hundreds of them from the late 40s to the 1850s. Remember, it was a weekly newspaper until the late 50s. He mastered that short form journalism. And always he's out there giving quite formal speeches, and the most formal of all is his masterpiece, of course, done in 1852, which Julia may have had a hand in editing a bit, we don't know. But the great 4th of July speech, the rhetorical masterpiece of American anti-slavery, is that speech in 1852. And then, in 54, 55, he writes the long-form masterpiece of his life, My Bondage and My Freedom, the second autobiography, a highly political autobiography. At a time in his life when he barely could make ends meet and struggled to sustain any kind of faith, both in his cause and even in his own capacities, he did his greatest work. There is always with Douglass, it's very difficult to get at and explain because he'll never talk about it, a deep psychic price for this kind of life commitment to radical change, and whatever it costs and whatever it takes. And his his family and his wife Anna just have to live with it. A last little example, and then I do want to be quiet. This is just to give you a tiny piece of context for what becomes his life later, after the Civil War, in the wake of, well, during Reconstruction for sure. And even in the 1870s and early 80s, when he does have these 2 federal appointments, which give him a salary, a significant salary, he still did a lot of lecturing on the road. But before he got those appointments, he did these tours for 3 and 4 months every winter. And then he did many, many, many other lectures as well. In fact, in the book, I argue, I can't prove it, that Frederick Douglass traveled more miles in the 19th century than any other American. The only one who might have gone further was Mark Twain, but he went to Asia, so he was cheap. I also try to demonstrate that probably just by the sheer scale of his crowds and the sheer numbers of speeches, thousands and thousands of speeches, more people probably heard Douglass speak than any other American of the 19th century. This is just the opening paragraph of what's actually chapter 26. In mid-January 1877, a blizzard swept across western New York State. Frederick Douglass was once again out on the winter lecturing circuit. By the way, he got about $100 a speech, which was serious money. He came back from these things with a lot of cash, and he often demanded the money before he left. He found himself, quote, snowbound 15 miles from Corfu, a town between Buffalo and Rochester. By this point, he lives in Washington. He was, quote, unable to get east or west for 2 days, he told his old friend Amy Post in Rochester in a letter. With the assistance, he said, of 7 locomotives, he slowly reached Buffalo on tracks overlaid with snowdrifts. Almost unbelievably, his destination on this trip was first Detroit and then Traverse City, Michigan. If you know anything of the geography of Michigan, you know where Traverse City is? It's way up in the northwest corner of the lower peninsula. I am now, he said, about disgusted with my tour and wish myself back under your hospitable roof, he wrote to Mrs. Post, who lived in Rochester. But the idea of duty, which has hitherto commanded me, is still my master and will compel me to go on. He persevered and did indeed reach Traverse City to lecture there on January 19th. This grueling 2.5-month tour of at least 3,300 miles, it was a very typical tour, by rail, carriages, horseback, and I think at least 1 ox cart, delivering both political speeches and the self-made man speech, which is what people always wanted to hear, in 33 towns and cities, took him from Pennsylvania through New York to Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and back again through Ohio to Pennsylvania again, and then all the way back to Washington. The tour included all of the usual indignities, including yet another Jim Crow incident. He quit counting the times he'd been Jim Crow. In Springfield, Missouri, Douglass was invited, as he put it, into the kitchen to get his breakfast, segregated, at a hotel. He rejected the segregation and refused to eat. He did that dozens of times. The South, he said, is still the hell black South and will remain so for a good while longer. That duty Douglass named was still the primary livelihood of the burgeoning extended family back home in Washington of Douglasses, Spraggs, and many others. By the 1870s, Douglass had an enormous extended family, almost all of them financially and emotionally dependent on him. 4 adult children, 21 grandchildren, where the grandchildren started dying off in droves. None of them were born by the 1870s. No, that's right. They come later and they die later, of course. Fictive kin, he had fictive sisters. There were a number of proteges and hangers-on who were always around Cedar Hill, eventually, where he buys a big house. Douglass woke up every day with this enormous clan over which he was the patriarch in a host of ways. And that was the reality behind the public man every day of his life from 1865 until he died. I'll just stop there and maybe turn it over to this patient audience.
Okay, well, first of all, let's give you all a hand. Why don't we go straight into discussion with the audience, since we're at about 6:10 here. I see a couple of microphones in either aisle, so if you have a comment, a question that you'd like to offer up to our panelists. I know that I'm kind of burning with a question right now, because I'm very struck. Well, there are two themes that are really leaping out to me. This question of evidence in the archive. I was very struck, Nzadi, when you used the term twice of conjuring Anna's voice, and you also suggested that there was a context, sources, maybe more conventional sources that you had consulted to decide how you were going to conjure, or is conjuring a voice something that you decide upon? But the point here being that I'm struck by how, when it comes to writing the lives of women, what kind of sources are you relying on, especially in relationship to a man who abounded in traditional sources, it seems to me. The ways in which, Sarah, you talked about Douglass's, however precarious his work as a journalist proved to be in the 1840s, he had a tremendous presence in print culture. I'm curious to hear all of you kind of meditate a bit about what kinds of sources were you relying on to navigate with what we might call the gendered problem of the archive. So Nzadi, thinking about the ways in which you're having to conjure evidence or to channel Anna's voice. Lee, you had talked about, it was a very suggestive trope that you summoned, that in your own work you described the challenge of accounting for Anna's archival presence. Correct me if I have this wrong. It was a hole, you said, that actually allowed you, that Douglass's other relationships allowed you to kind of demarcate and to trace and to figure, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, she was, her, and especially his mother and his grandmother, there's a hole there. And so I wanted to try to, rather than just say there's a hole and go with platitudes, try to get as close of a shape as I could.
Okay, so then maybe the two of you could talk about how you discovered that shape. What sources did you use to produce something other than a hole in a record?
Hillary?
Oh, you go ahead, yeah.
When I first started to really meditate on Anna, I had read the narrative, the short book, and I'm a writing teacher an adjunct writing teacher, so with little kids. So I just sort of am walking around with this idea of what it would be like to be Frederick Douglass's wife, and then because I'm blessedly an adjunct and don't have committee work, etc. I go to the library one day and pull out all the Douglass history books I can find and go to the indexes, assuming that because he had this wife for 44 years that someone would have said some things about her, including him. And I find that there's very little, and then it's often that people are repeating the same thing that he says in the narrative. So I go to the internet, the wonderful internet, and I find the Frederick Douglass papers at the historic Smithsonian website, and find the booklet that Rosetta writes about her. But I'm still looking. So what I eventually started doing with Douglass histories is reading the absence of her. I read those books and skim those books, to be honest, for the places where she would seem to intersect, and there's nothing there. I also read letters at the Frederick Douglass Papers site, but on another level, I read a number of books about black women in the 19th century and started to conclude that she really didn't fall into predictable categories. The interesting thing about Anna Mary Douglass is that she was never enslaved. She was illiterate, technically, according to the way conventional literacy, and yet she was never enslaved. So I'm like, oh boy, she's an outsider all the way around. But finally, to wrap this up, so I did that kind of historical digging, but some of my most valuable material came from just sensory impressions from going to, especially from Baltimore. I had a very productive weekend in Baltimore, hanging out on the dock in the harbor area, and just feeling it and recording descriptions. I also went to her grave in Rochester, New York, and got a lot out of the fact that you wouldn't even know she's buried there if you don't know exactly where to look. Helen Pitts has a big old gravestone, and you would think she's the only wife. So that was some insight. But finally, and this is my final point, I gradually realized that my grandmother's life was influencing the way I understood Anna Mary Douglass. My grandmother was born in 1904. She was illiterate. She went to the 2nd grade. And even though she was born almost 100 years after Anna Mary Douglass, experiences for poor black women from the South were not that different that I couldn't, realize some worldview that might, give me some insight. So those were some of the things I did.
Okay. Yeah, there's actually the whole grave site is a story unto itself, because Helen's slab wasn't put there until like 1969, 1972, and it was put there by the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historic Association. And when she was putting Frederick's slab there, the sons put the taller one there with Anna and Annie's name on it. So it got into some family business. So with Anna, I started with what Rosetta said, and I use that as kind of my guidepost for finding her in, Ancestry.com was one of the best investments I ever made. And when I was single, I could meet a glass of wine, and that was a good Friday night. And you're going, how'd she ever get married? So anyway, he's still listening to me talk about Frederick Douglass. So, so I use that as kind of the guidepost to find her in a record. But also, again, looking in other biographies. I mean, I understood why Frederick didn't talk about Anna much, because he was protecting her respectability. It was a woman at that time, you did not put her in print except when she got married and when she died, and if she was, rich when she debuted. But otherwise, she wasn't in print. That was opening her up to be criticized. And that was what I thought when she had to come out and defend herself in the papers during the Julia Griffiths scandal. That to me said that was probably what she was most pissed about, was she's being drug into the papers by this, and this is what's unrespectable, disrespectable. And for a black woman, especially a black woman who looked like she looked, this was very risky. And so when I started looking in the biographies, who you would think would be a little more curious and try to find her, oh my God, some of the stuff, I was just like, I was so mad for her. That people saying these terrible things about her. And it was like she wasn't good enough for Douglass. And I thought, he chose her. He chose her. And they were married a long time. And you can't expect that to all be love and roses, first of all. And they did become different people. That happened. But he chose her. So why would he choose her? So where did she come from? And I had to look, where did she come from? And then start again to do the research of what was a woman like at that time. And of course, she's one of the judgments they pass on her, the historians pass on her, and everybody's always passing on her, is her illiteracy, her literacy, her literacy. And it became, why is it so important for her to be literate? And because at that time, where she comes from, being literate is not going to be common anyway. And so it comes from educated people like us who value literacy, and putting her in contrast to Douglass, who valued literacy and who saw it as core to his central being. Well, what did she see as core to central being? And so one of the things when somebody doesn't write something down, they do leave a record. And the record is the way they act. Now, you can't necessarily know what their motivations are in the way they act. But Annette Gordon-Reed said this about trying to understand Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings made choices. And so what she had to do was understand what were the other choices. And so that's what I had to do with Anna in some ways. And then with the mother, with Harriet Bailey and Betsy Bailey, I was fortunate that Dixon Preston did kind of went back into the archives back in, I guess it was the 70s or 80s.
That's the most important book on Douglass ever done, for us.
Yeah, and he basically what he was doing was he was going to verify what Douglass said in the record. And so he did. I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. And so there's Thomas Auld's like daybook and records and things like that. So you can go in and you can kind of find her Betsy Bailey in there and Harriet in there. And so again, you have to, okay, here she's impressing herself in the record. And I was kind of shocked to find like Isaac Bailey in the census.
That's his grandfather.
Yes. That was exact look I had when I said, holy crap, Isaac Bailey in the census. And so I'm like, I don't know if it's the Isaac Bailey, but certainly the household matched up. It was in the right place. And I was like, yeah, I know. I know, of course, it's 1820 census, so it's just hashtag. But hashtags, boy, hash marks. But yeah, it's so trying to get just all these little pieces of evidence, like squirreling these bits of evidence together. And then reading all the research on enslaved women and enslaved life, and looking at the way the slave life, and okay, what choices did she have? And what did she do? And what do we know she did? And then the way most people look at her is Douglass, and he's the center of the story. Well, if you look at her story, he's not the center of her story. He's over here. So what are all the other contingencies in her life in relation to him? Mm-hmm. And that shifts it. Mm-hmm.
I'll just throw in two pieces of evidence, too. I mean, you are left wanting to do what Nzadi can do,
yeah,
which you can't. But you do have to imagine your way into Anna's work, as you suggest. But in that famous piece by Rosetta, which she writes in like 1904, 4, My Mother as I Recall Her, there are all sorts of little revealing anecdotes. And I think I had read that thing 9 times before I somehow saw the anecdote where she describes father coming home from Britain in 47. He's been abroad for 19 months. It's his first day, maybe breakfast at home. And she says, she remembered him asking something about, how are you paying the bills? And she says, my mother went to the bureau, pulled out the bank book, brought it onto the table and said, it's balanced, don't worry. And I thought, She did her numbers fine.
We pointed that out. We did a thing together,
Yeah,
and Nzadi
yeah,
pointed
it's
out
just-
that she does numbers, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's that. But then also, I mean, the reason I'm doing this biography is because of a private collection I encountered in Savannah, Georgia, which Lee has now used and other people have used. And in that enormous, incredible Walter Evans collection, there's yet another narrative by the son Charles. It's called Growing Up in the Douglass Home. There's a good deal in there about his mother, a good deal. There are sources for
Yeah.
him.
Though it's telling that those are in private collections.
That's true.
Yeah.
Not for long, I hope.
They get, yes, would you like to? Okay.
I have two quickies. One, anyway, in the map of where he would give all the lectures, there were a tremendous amount given in Scotland. I'm wondering why Scotland, as opposed to London or other places in England. And my other question, in the say 1845 Douglass, before he became internationally famous, what was his relationships with both other women and with other men? David doesn't have to give us a spoiler alert on the book, but I'm just wondering if the time between when he runs away from Baltimore and when he's say 1845, what are his relationships with some of the other people that he has to deal with?
I'll talk about Scotland first. But so when Douglass arrived in Ireland, that was the first place that he started lecturing, really. He heard about something called the Free Church controversy. So, long story short, in 1843, the established Church of Scotland, or a small section, broke away from the established church, basically, to form the Free Church of Scotland. And to raise money for this new organisation, several Scottish ministers went over to the US, and £3,000 were raised given from southern slaveholders. So they went back to the UK, went back to Scotland with a lot of money from across the US, but again, quite a large amount from the south. And they put that money into building free churches across Scotland. And there was some abolitionist agitation on the subjects on both sides of the Atlantic, but Douglass, being the incredible orator that he is, he created a slogan called "Send Back the Money," and he really lit Scotland alight, basically. He was speaking twice a day, he was speaking to thousands of people. The campaign slogan, "Send Back the Money," was painted in red paint across free church buildings and pavements and free churches themselves. He even carved it on one of the hills in Scotland, in Edinburgh. So he was incredibly popular in Scotland, so that's why you see such a high concentration there, because of this massive campaign. I mean, ultimately the money was never returned, but Douglass says in his later autobiography that it doesn't actually matter that the money was never returned. It's making the Scottish people familiar with anti-slavery. And he gives some of his best speeches in Scotland as well. And just to say something a little bit about the relationships, one of the key things I argue in my PhD about him being in Britain is that he is forging friendships and networks that he will cultivate for the rest of his life. And that's not only with people, that's with newspapers. So you can see when he's in Britain that he's going to become such a powerful editor and journalist, because he's writing to newspapers, he's mentioning specific newspapers in his speeches because he knows they're going to reprint his speeches, but then also he'll talk about one particular Scottish newspaper that slates him, and then he knows that instantly that newspaper is going to reprint his story, and then others are going to jump to his defence. So he's incredibly gifted at creating those sorts of those networks and friendships. But I don't know if anyone else want to come on that.
Oh, he fell in love with Scotland for life, and they with him, and with Burns. He did a pilgrimage there. And Burns becomes the third or fourth most quoted writer throughout his work.
Well, also...
That's after Shakespeare and the Bible.
Oh, sorry. I interrupt. But also the stress he was under while he's in the middle of the Free Church campaign. Thomas Smythe, who was a South Carolinian, his son married the daughter of the woman I wrote my first book on, because it's 6 degrees of Frederick Douglass. So Thomas Smythe decided he's going to shut down Douglass by saying, well, I heard somebody who told me that Douglass came out of a brothel in Manchester. And so they're going straight to accuse him of sex and, bringing up the image of the black, sexually oversexed man. And Douglass sues him. But it becomes this very stressful situation. And this is all going on during this. And he's having to write apologetic letters later to friends who he wrote rather snippy letters to.
Hannah's website of his tours allowed me to say he hadn't even been in Manchester.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I hope that's still true, because that's what it says.
Not long enough. Well, anyway, so,
Go ahead.
There's another question.
Thank you all so much for being here and for this panel. It's really wonderful. I have a question, I guess, for Hannah and Sarah. I'm just so curious about the popularity of him in the UK, and what was the nature of that vis-a-vis British legacies of slavery and slave trade? Having this charismatic man from the U.S. come speaking mostly about slavery in the U.S., I imagine. Was there any kind of deflection then of British involvement in slavery?
Absolutely, I think. Two things. I think nearly 15 years after Britain is supposed to have abolished its own slavery in the West Indies, it's a much more comfortable topic to think about, someone else's slavery, and you can feel indignant about it without having to worry about your own complicity. But having said that, the movement that brought about the end of British slavery is also still there. The people who felt strongly about it and boycotted sugar and wrote to their MPs and so on. So it's both a more comfortable subject and a familiar subject. And then also there's the celebrity aspect that you were talking about. This is an American. I mean, that's exotic enough. And then it's an African American who's incredibly articulate and eloquent. That's kind of exciting. And then he says very stirring things, and he's funny and witty, and he's a good night out on your train, your special train.
Yes.
Can we quote you on that? Good.
Then he's something you go and see because your friends have been to see him as well. So it was sort of win-win-win.
And yeah, I'd like to add actually that it's a very deliberate political strategy not to say directly, slavery still exists, you paid the slave owners off, basically, because that's what happened with abolition, British abolition. He's very, very careful in his language, so what he does is that every speech is structured. There are several speeches where I found that he gets really angry, and then that's when he kind of goes off on one, not necessarily about British abolition, but he just gets angry and passionate. But he'll start off and say that Britain deserves its glorious reputation because I stand here, I feel free for the first time. I can walk down the street with a white woman on my arm and I'm not going to be beaten up or accosted because of that. I don't have to sit in a so-called Negro pew at the church. I can dine wherever I want, etc. But then in some speeches he does chastise the British and say, while you have passed the, abolition, there's still an element that you greatly benefit from slavery still. The 90% of cotton that's imported through Liverpool is slave grown in the south. And so he does, there's that kind of delicate balance. And there's a speech that he gives in 1846 in London, and he's talking about slavery, and he's talking about the auction block basically, and a slave person being sold. And somebody in the crowd interrupts him and says, well, how much is a slave worth? And Douglass instantly replies and says, the value of a slave in Louisiana is matched by the price of cotton in Manchester. So not only is that just such a witty and amazing rebuttal, because it instantly shuts the guy up, as you can imagine, but he is incredibly aware that not only is it a political strategy that he's not always deliberately saying what Britain still has to do, but that's another testament to his performative abilities, basically.
And he couldn't quite fully warm up to the Chartists.
No, that's it. Yeah.
But he also hated the minstrels.
Yes, yeah.
He's very upset about the British minstrel teams that are going around.
He also gets really annoyed, actually, that in his last speech in London, that a minstrel performer basically opens his speech. So he gets really pissed off at that.
We have a question here.
I really enjoyed this. Thanks so much. It's very inspiring, and I love poetry, so it's wonderful to be able to listen from home again, to this wonderful point at the end of the week. I have a prejudice question. I'm an archive rat. I love archives, but one of the things that I've noticed on social media this year is just the amount of rallying around Douglass's figure. For instance, on Twitter, there's a certain heaviness to people's feelings on it. And I'm just wondering, what does it mean?
God, is anybody collecting that?
So I'm just, there are all kinds of hashtags, David. So.
I know, but I don't do it.
You'll show me later.
Show me later.
No, but I'm just wondering, what does it mean to write about Douglass right now in the wake of Black Lives Matter? How do you see your project related to this particular moment in the present politically?
I actually have a conclusion in my PhD actually brings the Black Lives Matter movement into it. So I start in the 1830s and finish in the 1890s. And the arc that I have throughout my PhD is something that Frederick Douglass contributes to. So something that actually begins with Moses Roper, another formerly enslaved individual. And he says that in 1838, you've heard the slaveholder's side of the story, it's now time for the slaves to speak. And Douglass says numerous similar things to that. And then in I.W. Wells says in 1893, when she's in the UK, that I am here to give the black people's side of the story. So there's this whole arc of black testimony, and then I sort of talk about how obviously the Black Lives Matter movement, that idea of black testimony, black resistance, is inherited from people like Douglass, but also not only people who are as famous as Douglass, but also people that we don't know a lot about. So I guess that would be my 2 cents into it.
Well, I find, I teach, in Syracuse, and I find a lot of people, they like to think I would have marched with Martin Luther King. Yeah, I would have been an abolitionist. And it's like, are you taking the knee with Colin Kaepernick? Well, then maybe you wouldn't have. Mm-hmm. And I'm teaching a class right now I call From Civil War to Civil Rights, but I'm taking the long view of the long civil rights movement, and I'm going to, at the end of the semester, have them read the new book that came out, When They Call You a Terrorist, which is really powerful. But and I'm telling them, read this and listen to it. This is like reading a slave narrative back in those days. Okay, think of it like that. Think of it like this is a person telling you their experience. So shut yourself up and listen to it. And think of it as that analogy, because you have to, like Hannah was saying, you have to listen to the voices of the people who are going through the experience if you want to do something to address the injustice. Because this class, nice white kids, but there's something, you have to listen to what's going on in the world if you really want to be part of this and make it better.
I don't know, the Trump era and the Trumpites have gotten 3 good Douglass op-eds out of me already, so it's the gift that keeps on giving. I'd be fascinated to know more later about all the social media using Douglass. I mean, that fascinates me. Because back in the 60s, Douglass kind of took a dive in a certain way during the Black Power moment. Sort of. But
Not entirely, I know. It depends.
That was decided that without struggle, there is no freedom, right?
I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't.
James Douglas's original words said without struggle, there can be no progress. And he was very strong in India.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Wow.
He wasn't up front. Well, I'm speaking like our president now. But the young people did not quote him directly and so forth, but they had his power with them.
Great.
I think we have time for one more question, yeah.
So my question is about Douglass as a listener and as an organizer. And I think that given the number, it is staggering the number of speeches he gave and where all those different kinds of people he's talking, engaging, as well as the intimate people he's listening to and learning from and being shaped by. But I guess I'm wondering, and just to reflect on, I think part of what is so brilliant about this panel, but also the thinking in the contemporary moment, is to think of him as this extraordinary organizer. But I'm wondering if you could maybe reflect on, as part of his great oratory, is also what kind of listener he is. Because if you're just seeking popularity, people are going to disappoint you pretty quick. You're going to learn certain things you can't say. You don't really want to insult the British Empire too much.
Not if you want to stay.
Well, maybe you do. Maybe he could do things he could, but I'm wondering where the pushback, how we move from listening from his audience or from using this in his life.
Could I say something about that?
Yeah,
Because I think you can see that in the editing. That Douglass is a very generous editor. If you compare him with Charles Dickens, who insisted that everyone who wrote for household words had to write as if they were Charles Dickens, and it must be anonymous, so everything in household words had to be Dickensian. Douglass's paper is full of different voices. Including voices saying things he doesn't believe in. So he publishes people who believe in colonization. He will even publish letters from pro-slavery newspapers because he knows that all his readers will think, ha, when they read them, and they'll kind of share a reaction. But he's not afraid of contrary voices and various voices. And people disagree with each other in the newspapers. So Julia Griffiths doesn't think bloomers are a very good idea, but some of Douglass's readers have taken to wearing bloomers. Douglass doesn't believe in spiritualism, but his friends the Posts do, and many people in Rochester do. There's someone who writes in and complains about the fact he's got so many adverts for water cures in his paper and says, I'm a doctor and that's quackery. And someone else writes back and says, no, I've seen people get really quite, better at the water cure. So there's a kind of argument. I mean, not just dialogue, actual argument. And I think if you edit like that, you're listening. But then, strangely, when he closes down the paper, he writes a sort of farewell editorial in which he says, don't worry, there are still other organs that I'll be writing for. You'll still hear my voice. And it's as though he doesn't realize how many other voices he's brought to be heard. And maybe that's one of the questions about archives that you were talking about, because we don't have Julia Griffiths' picture, we don't know much about her. All we have is we do have some private letters, but the majority of what we have is what Douglass printed. He himself was an archivist.
I just add quickly to that, Gunther. One of the things I've come to believe about Douglass, it's one of the things over time you just come to a sense of, is that he was a sponge. And he had to be. I mean, he didn't have any formal schooling. If he met you, he'd figure out what he can learn from you. And once he might have learned what he thinks he can learn from you, he moves on. He's also hypersensitive, especially when young. And a lot of the abolitionists complain about that. They can't stand him at times because they think he's arrogant and hypersensitive, which he was. But he was a sponge, always trying to figure out what he can learn here, learn there, learn from you, learn from someone else. And a voracious reader. In fact, again, this is one of the places Julia is so important in it. Julia helps him create his first book collection. She ships it from England. That's how he starts collecting books.
Well, thank you all for staying and learning with us, and thanks to our panelists today. And this has been live streamed, correct?
Yes.
So if you want to go over some of the discussion that we've had or to review some of the comments that our speakers have shared with us, you can go to the Gilder Lehrman Center's website, and I do believe that Nzadi's book is for sale.
Yeah, there's a few copies.
A few copies left, so if you'd like to purchase one, you'll take care of that.
Yep.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.